I declare the International Exhibition now open, President Ulysses S. Grant announces on the morning of May 10, 1876. Crowds roar as the American flag rises to the top of the main building. The chorus, orchestra, and organ join together and handles Hallelujah Chorus, while a parade of dignitaries and 4,000 specially invited guests pave the way to Machinery Hall, where the coreless engine stands. The engine, providing enough energy to power all of the machines on the fairgrounds, with 2,500 horsepower, is a 45-foot-tall steel giant and masterpiece of American engineering. President Grant and Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II ascend the engine's platform, and at the signal of inventor George H. Corliss, they turn the wheels to arouse the engine from its slumber. As the engine awakes, the rest of the machines in the hall take their first breath, and the exhibition comes to life. Cheers erupt as the doors to all exhibits open, and spectators begin exploring the fairgrounds. The representation of women and African Americans in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Historical Register of the Centennial Exposition, 1876, and James McCabe Jr.'s The Illustrated History of the Centennial Exhibition demonstrates in many ways the attitudes of American society at the time. Through the examination of these two books, readers can examine distinctly important views of American society. Not only the differing perceptions of women's suffrage, but the conflicting views of the North and South, in order to further understand the role of women and African Americans at the close of the Reconstruction era in the late 19th century. In a much larger picture, the illustrations and descriptions reveal America's need to establish an identity in the global world. The emergence of the women's suffrage movement at the exhibition did not mean that women would soon be granted the same rights as men. Instead, it was only the beginning of the demand for female equality. Similarly, the end of the Civil War did not signify an ease of racial tension between the North and South. It merely represented that the national laws would agree to serve the same goals. Leslie and McCabe's publications were a means of expressing all of these differing views. For the sake of time, we will delve into an analysis of the images and text within each publication. Women played a very important role in the exhibition. Under the leadership of Eleanor Gillespie, the great-granddaughter of Benjamin Franklin, a group of women formed the Women's Centennial Executive Committee. The committee raised $126,000 for the Treasury of the Board of Finance and assisted with marketing the exhibition to the public. The Women's Committee felt that it was important for the main building to display exhibits from around the world. The women raised enough global awareness that they lost their own spot in the main building because so many countries wanted to represent themselves at the exhibition. This, however, did not deter the women. Instead, in 4 months' time, they raised $30,000 to build the Women's Pavilion, which stood in Fairmount Park, west of the Horticulture Building. The committee used this pavilion to raise awareness of women's influence on American culture by displaying a variety of exhibits by women, ranging from their contribution to literature to their impact on technology. Each publication fails to mention the true motive behind women's participation in the exhibition. Although the United States had come a long way since its independence, many Americans still considered women inferior to men. By having their own pavilion, women were able to share pamphlets about the women's suffrage movement and use the exhibition as a platform to reach out to thousands of people about the importance of female equality. However, some scholars, such as Gary Nash in his book First City, Philadelphia and the Forging of Historical Memory, argue that the Women's Committee did not use the exhibition to its full potential. For example, the National Woman Suffrage Association sent an exhibit to be displayed in the Women's Pavilion. According to Nash, the Women's Committee, quote, tucked the exhibit away where the public could hardly find it, end quote. Although this does validate Nash's argument, recognizing that the exhibits within the pavilion all symbolized the growing importance of women in American society is more significant than whether or not women's suffrage was overtly represented. American society's differing views of women's equality, active participation, and innovation at the exhibition are represented throughout the images and texts of Leslie and McCabe's books. Leslie and McCabe's publications do share a couple of similarities regarding their discussion of women. These include having a specific section of each book dedicated to women, as well as recording the prayer given by Bishop Matthew Simpson, a bishop in the Methodist Episcopal Church and the sole religious leader on the grandstand at the opening ceremony. In it, he said, "We pray that benediction especially on the women of America, who, for the first time in the history of our race, take so conspicuous a place in a national celebration. May the light of their intelligence, purity, and enterprise shed its beams afar until, in distant lands, their sisters may realize the beauty and glory of Christian freedom and elevation." Simpson is very forward with his acknowledgement of women's work and place in society, and sheds a positive light on women in America by encouraging them in their growth. Although both books do include this prayer and devote a portion of their text to female efforts, the way Leslie and McCabe portray women is profoundly different. In Leslie's Register, images depict women as active participants in the exhibition, and the text describes more details of how women were involved. McCabe's History, on the other hand, rarely focuses on women in its illustrations and provides little detail on female participation. Many images, too many to mention all examples, throughout Leslie's Register attest to the involvement of women at the exhibition. A few illustrations of different exhibits, such as the fur and confectionery displays, depict women as the sole viewers of the exhibit. Although the focal point of these images is the individual exhibit, as it takes up a greater portion of the illustration and the women are not directly facing the viewer, having women as the only people present shows that women were important visitors at the exhibition. Other images in the register illustrate women as the main focus. Two images that particularly stand out among the rest include one of a woman in a wheelchair who is viewing some of the Chinese wares, and another of a woman playing with her daughter at one of the weapons exhibits. Although both images take up the majority of the page and the women are clearly the focal point of the illustration, these images do not appear to be significant. Within the context of American society at the time, however, the incorporation of so many pictures of women is fascinating. The inclusion of women in the images exemplifies the important role they were taking on in society. A role that embraced the innovative spirit of America and was willing to make a stand for female equality. One way that women's innovation is highlighted in Leslie's Register is through the illustration and description of the kindergarten exhibit at the Women's Pavilion. In this image, two women are intently teaching a lesson to a table full of children. A group of spectators is observing the classroom in the background. Incorporating kindergarten into the school system was an emerging idea in the 19th century. In the United States school system had not yet adopted this new teaching philosophy created by Frederick Froebel, who first introduced the idea in Germany in 1837. By demonstrating this idea at the exhibition, Leslie states that the Women's Committee may have caused schools to, quote, introduce the system where it was presently unknown, end quote. Of course, Leslie does not only show women's prominence in this one instance. He also features their participation in his discussion of the Women's Day celebration. Not only were members of the Women's Centennial Committee and Women's Suffrage Association involved in the Centennial exhibition, but women across the United States played an important role as well. Leslie discusses how it was, quote, naturally noticeable that more women were at the exhibition on November 7th, not only because of the Women's Day reception, but also because it was Election Day. Thus, the majority of men were away at the polls. Leslie's mention of the Women's Day celebration represents that women were not willing to accept a second-rate place in society behind men. Even though women were unable to vote, partaking in Women's Day shows that they were still active members of society. The idea of celebrating Women's Day on Election Day was a genius idea by Gillespie and the members of the Women's Committee. Election Day, being a day that emphasized women's inferiority and lack of political power in society, made a perfect platform to spread the word of women's suffrage. Through his use of a multitude of images and portions of text highlighting women's involvement at the exhibition, Leslie's Register presents the ways in which women of the 19th century were innovative and actively involved in American society. Leslie does this by not only featuring women in many of his illustrations, but by discussing specific ways in which women were pioneering ideas like kindergarten and participating in special events dedicated to themselves, such as the Women's Day celebration. These are only a few of the examples within Leslie's Register that demonstrate this view of women in society. However, this positive and outgoing portrayal of women was not the only mindset present in America in 1876. McCabe shines a very different light on women at the exhibition. The illustrations in McCabe's History did not put women in the spotlight. The history does not even include an illustration featuring a woman in its section dedicated to the Women's Pavilion. Rather, McCabe's illustrations depict women as either small and obscured or with their backs facing the viewer. This representation of women supports the idea that women were not worthy of an equal role in society. The discussion of women in McCabe's text also supports the idea of women's inferiority. In the Women's Pavilion, Emma Allison operated a 6-horsepower engine that powered the machinery in the building. Rather than discussing this as an example of women's innovation, McCabe comments that, quote, if Miss Allison did nothing else, she offered an example worth following to the engineers of the male sex in the neatness of her dress and the perfection of cleanliness exhibited in both engine and engine room." End quote. McCabe's further explanation of the Women's Pavilion does not recognize women for their achievements, but more so records the items on display with little regard to their significance. Considering the contributions women had made to society, McCabe's representation of women is poor and lacking in content, specifically when compared to Leslie's register. Unlike Leslie, McCabe makes no mention of the kindergarten exhibit or the Women's Day celebration. Unfortunately, women were not the only people facing injustice and inequality in 19th century America. African Americans also faced oppression, which is seen in two different lights through Leslie and McCabe's publications. In a time focusing on freedom in the United States, African Americans were not explicitly excluded from the festivities of the exhibition, but they certainly were not welcomed openly into the community. Because of this unfair treatment, African Americans participated minimally in the exhibition. Thus, neither Leslie nor McCabe dedicate a section in their books to African Americans. However, each publication reprinted the words of John Greenleaf Whittier's Centennial hymn in their accounts of the opening ceremony. Whittier was a well-known poet and abolitionist in the United States. The Centennial hymn combined these two passions to create what McCabe called, quote, "a fine, vigorous production, worthy of the genius of the poet," end quote. Various lyrics of the hymn allude to the importance of the emancipation of slavery by describing the glad refrain of rendered bolt and broken chain, and manhood never bought nor sold. The final line of the hymn states, "Let the new cycle shame the old," speaking of America's commitment to growth as a country and how the new era after Reconstruction would be increasingly better than the one before it. By addressing these issues through song, Whittier was able to share the message of how far the United States had come in the last century with reaching the Founding Fathers' goals of a free nation where all men are created equal, while also stressing the improvements that American society still needed to make. The exhibits that displayed works of art most prominently portrayed African Americans. Of the thousands of art pieces featured at the exhibition, very few African American artists had works on display. Two of these pieces were The Death of Cleopatra, a sculpture by Edmonia Lewis, and a painting by Edward Bannister called Under the Oaks. Under the Oaks received a gold medal at the exhibition. However, when the judges realized that Bannister was black, they considered taking away his award. Conversely, white participants insisted that Bannister maintain the prize, which made Bannister the first African American to win an American National Art Award. These two exhibits are examples of the few pieces that represented one role African Americans were playing in America. The exhibit that most directly represented emancipation and African American freedom was a sculpture by Francesco Pescara, an Austrian artist, called The Freed Slave. Leslie and McCabe each dealt with these exhibits in different ways, specifically the exhibits displaying the works of Bannister and Pescara. Leslie addresses both Pescara and Bannister in the register. Leslie includes an etching of Pescara's statue, The Freed Slave, which shows the statue surrounded by African Americans who are intently gazing at the figure. In the foreground of the picture is a mother who appears to be telling her young children about the statue. The reverence and solemnity surrounding the spectators resonates in this etching. Each person depicted seems to be drawn toward the statue and what it is saying about newfound freedom for slaves in America. Depicting African Americans in this role at the exhibition demonstrates the popular Northern belief that African Americans deserved freedom. The illustration also recognizes the importance of remembering the history of slavery as seen in the way the mother shows her children the statue, as well as the significance of how far African Americans had come in being able to participate in everyday aspects of American life. Leslie's register gives a fairly detailed account of the artists with work at the exhibition as well. Leslie's discussion of Bannister's painting is another example of Leslie's support of African American equality. In his discussion of Under the Oaks, Leslie treats Bannister as every other artist whose work was on display, giving him equal respect, analysis, and discussion. Leslie describes the detail and, quote, "wonderful closeness" of Bannister's work, and never mentions that he is black or makes any comment that would hint at his inferiority. Making no distinction of Bannister's skin color may be the most profound way that Leslie demonstrates the importance of equality for African Americans. Unlike the register, McCabe's history includes only two pictures of African Americans. One image is an etching of an African American young man pushing a cart with luggage for a white man. The white man in the picture is directing the young man where to take the cart with a look of disdain. This picture displays the side of American society that still saw African Americans as unequal to white citizens. The other is an illustration of a Kentucky home, which is a painting by Eastman Johnson that depicts a similar sentiment. A Kentucky home paints a very stereotypical view of African American life in the South, and is an entirely different discussion of art than what Leslie writes. McCabe's Southern views are clearly portrayed in the way he talks about this piece of art. Not only does McCabe highlight Johnson's painting, but he describes it as being done in the, quote, happiest style, which shows that McCabe supports Johnson's stereotype. A Kentucky home also illuminates an interesting perspective of 19th century American society. The painting is of a poor African American family playing music and enjoying time together outside of their ramshackle house. In the background of the painting, a white woman is timidly entering the scene. This symbolizes the trepidation and fear members of the white society had upon entering an unfamiliar culture. The woman is curious but clearly hesitant about fully engaging in the family's activities. By including this image, McCabe demonstrates the hesitancy of white Americans to allow African Americans an equal place in society. Writers of all levels recorded their experiences at the Centennial exhibition, with Leslie and McCabe being only two of these authors. Each author used his respective work to publicize his views of the role of women and African Americans in 19th century America. Whether readers at the time recognized the incorporation of these views is unknown. The importance lies not in who read the books, but how each publication portrayed American society at the exhibition, where Leslie is critical and inclusive in his discussion of women and African Americans. McCabe is subjective and exclusive. These books are not simply souvenirs or memoirs of the exhibition. They demonstrate important, conflicting interpretations on how society was functioning at the time. With clouds and rain blotting the sky on November 10, 1876, President Grant once again takes the stage. "I have now the honor to declare the exhibition closed," he proclaims. At 4 o'clock, the sound of a gong rises in Machinery Hall, signaling 2 engineers to turn off the coreless engine. As the great engine ceases and the hiss of machinery dies to a quiet monotony, visitors disperse from Fairmount Park, forever leaving behind the fair that served as a platform for so many. In the coming days, buildings are torn down and exhibits find new homes. The growing silence encompassing Fairmount Park is contradicted with the rising cries for equality coming from women and African Americans as the women's suffrage and civil rights movements continue to root themselves firmly in American society. A new era arises in the United States, an era encompassing the closing thoughts of Whittier's hymn. "O make thou us through centuries long, in peace secure and justice strong, around our gift of freedom draw the safeguards of thy righteous law, and cast in some diviner mold, let the new cycle shame the old."